Alrighty, welcome back to Grand Prix Omaha here. We've got a round 6 feature match. Brandon Ayers at 5-0 with Temur Marvel against John Stern at 5-0 with Mono Black Zombies.
Funny, I saw John at Grand Prix Montreal 2 weeks ago, and he was playing, if memory serves, Temur Marvel. So it's funny that Marvel is, pretty widely considered the top deck in Standard, but to see a really strong player like John switch away from it is a bit telling.
Yeah, I actually had the same flight here with John, and we chatted a bit about his deck selection. He thinks that a lot of people are moving towards builds of Marvel that have gotten weaker against zombies, fewer sweepers like Sweltering Suns, and more copies of like Glimmer of Genius, that sort of thing. So he thinks zombies is a little bit more well-positioned than maybe it was earlier.
Yeah, my deck choice for Grand Prix Montreal, just to refresh people's memory, this was 1 week after Jerry Thompson won the Pro Tour with Mono Black Zombies. So I chose Temur Marvel, and I really loaded up on anti-zombies cards. I knew the mirror match was going to be popular, but zombies, it's just there are cards out there that if you put them in your deck, they're going to really, really help against zombies. So that's appealing to play like a lot of Sweltering Suns, a lot of Chandra Flamecallers. But it ended up being a big mistake for that tournament. Zombies was not one of the most played decks, and now with people, as you mentioned, adjusting more for like Marvel mirrors and blue-red control, they're not going to be playing a lot of these main deck sweepers, and maybe John can hit the nail on the head here with playing zombies when people aren't prepared for it.
Yeah, if you take a look at Brandon's deck list, he's got 3 Dissenter's Deliverance, 3 Censor, only 1 Chandra. These are 2 negates in the main deck. Like these are kind of changes that are going to be weak against draws like John's, where he has a turn 1 Crypt Breaker into turn 2 Miasmic Mummy.
We know that zombies is a really, really powerful deck when people aren't gunning for it.
And both players discarding cards that are not going to be all that effective here. Fatal Push, not great in the matchup. On John's side, and of course, Ulamog. Not very easy to cast on Brandon's side.
Funny, I wonder if the presence of Ulamog as a card that people put in their deck but don't particularly want to draw, I wonder if that changes the value of a card like Miasmic Mummy.
Yeah, it did not cost Brandon very much to discard at Ulamog, so I think that does blunt the effectiveness of Miasmic Mummy some. Brandon has turn 2 Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, turn 3 leaving mana up, which is kind of the classic Marvel curve. This sets up for the turn 4 Marvel quite nicely.
Yeah, really just a 2-card combo in that sense. Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot lands and a Marvel lets you spin on turn 4.
So John has a fairly classic decision here. Assuming he's got another zombie to play, it's whether he wants to attack with his 2 zombies or draw a card off Crypt Breaker. Where do you usually fall on this kind of decision?
I like to draw a card. I think zombies, while it isn't an aggro deck, it's not so much of a nickel and dime type of aggro deck where you're trying to rush your opponent's life total down. It's more that you're trying to set up a winning board state, and by the time the zombie board state gets impressive, you could usually attack for lethal in the course of 1 or 2 turns.
So John chose to not attack, and Brandon actually has end of turn Harness Lightning, which does give John the opportunity to draw a card off of Crypt Breaker, which he does.
I'll say from experience that most of the time when my opponent has a Crypt Breaker and I choose not to kill it, I regret it. But the same is true of Diregraph Colossus, and if Brandon thinks that he can either manage the board or win the game in a pretty relevant time frame, then that could certainly have been a calculated risk to leave the Crypt Breaker in play.
It does give John a card drawing engine, and now if John has another zombie, he can activate Crypt Breaker once again. Another Miasmic Mummy here for John. It's always the second Miasmic Mummy that gets you.
Yeah, that's an effect that does get better in multiples. So the fact that Brandon responds with Glimmer of Genius indicates to me that he values the other 2 cards in his hand, because he might think, well, let me see if I can draw it to something that's not particularly useful, and I'll throw that one away and keep the 2 I already have.
So Brandon goes up to 4 cards here, but both players are going to have to discard to the Mummy. And then once again, John's going to have the choice of whether to attack for 3 or to draw an additional card. And last turn he chose to draw cards. With Brandon at 22, would you expect that decision to change now?
No, I think he'll make the same play, especially given that the one, real card Brandon has played to the board here is Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot. Doesn't make much sense to try to spend a turn dealing 3 damage when the opponent's just going to spend their next turn gaining 3 life.
John discarding a Dread Wanderer. Nice little combo there. And Brandon just drew a negate. So this is not one of the cards you're super excited about. Though, once John gets to the point where he starts trying to cast Liliana's Mastery, negate actually does have a powerful effect.
Agreed. Yeah, this is the point in the game where Brandon is most happy to have the negate. It's not clogging up your hand in the early turns where you really need to fight over creatures, but it is insurance against what's probably John's most powerful card. One thing that's really cool about Miasmic Mummy is it does lead to situations where you can play the Diregraph Colossus early in the game and have it be out of range of burn spells.
Yeah, that's quite powerful. And in fact, we see now a 4/4 Diregraph Colossus followed immediately by a Crypt Breaker, making a zombie token. And this is exactly what you're talking about before. John isn't nickel and diming, Brandon, but all of a sudden his board now has ballooned to 12 power. So he can kill in just a few quick hits, even if he's using Crypt Breaker aggressively to draw cards.
And I think it's a really smart play by John to play creatures pre-combat here because it puts Brandon to the test of if he's going to respond by killing zombies, and if Brandon does not, now John Stern knows exactly how much he can afford to attack with and still be able to draw a card with Crypt Breaker.
So what is Brandon looking for now that he's facing down this board of 6 zombies, one of them being a 4/4?
Well, he's not going to win a fair fight here. He can't hope to assemble, Rogue Refiners and Harness Lightnings to beat this. He's going to either need a board sweeper or he's going to need Marvel into Ulamog. As you mentioned, 1 Chandra Flamecaller, which is probably the card he would most want to see. But other than that, he's just hoping to get the Marvel going.
And he's churning through his deck. He cast a Glimmer here. He's cycling a Dissenter's Deliverance. But as of right now, well, there we go. Aetherworks Marvel. So now Brandon is going to get a shot at finding Chandra or Ulamog. 5 cards that could swing the game fairly well here. Is everything else basically just a miss?
Yeah, there's some slight rebuys, Harness Lightning to kill Diregraph Colossus or a Chump Blocker, something that gives some more energy. Doesn't look like he hit what he needed.
No, and he did hit another Marvel, so he can play the second Marvel because they're legendary, choose to keep the untapped one, gain 2 energy off the one that leaves the battlefield, but that still leaves him 1 energy short of spinning the Marvel again on this turn.
So he can't choose anything that affects the board here. Taking a quick look at John's side of the table, he has 12 power with 6 attackers, so he's multiple cards off from being able to attack for lethal here. He would need maybe 2 Lords or something like that.
He's putting Brandon on a 2-turn clock. Is there a way that John can make his board impervious to a sweeper?
Well, the sweepers he should be thinking about right now are Sweltering Suns and Chandra. So if he could get the Diregraph Colossus at least up to 5 toughness, that's going to make 1 threat that he can feel safe as being in the bank for him. But even going wide here with more small creatures would be a relevant way to affect the board because Brandon has some parlays, including Ulamog, that might allow him to survive. Did I miscount? Maybe that was 17. I thought I had counted 16, but
I think it was 12 plus with 6 zombies, and then the Lord makes that 18.
Oh, 18. Okay.
So Lord of the Accursed comes down for John Stern to take game 1 against Brandon Ayers here. And we'll be back with game 2 after these messages. Luis Scott Vargas here with Reed Duke, and sometimes we'll have some live look-ins, but everyone's actually shuffling right now. Pretty inconsiderate of them, honestly. So, no live look-ins, even though we'll be able to catch potentially some more matches later. We have John Stern here, up a game against Brandon Ayers with Mono Black Zombies defeating Temur Marvel.
I like watching a full match of Zombies versus Marvel because in some matchups it's very clear who benefits from sideboarding, but not necessarily the case in Marvel versus Zombies. It depends a lot on what particular cards each player is packing in their sideboard. It depends on if the Marvel player has a good plan B against a card like Dispossess or Lost Legacy. In this case, it looks like John is going to be bringing in a handful of hand disruption spells, including Transgress the Mind, and just one copy of Dispossess. And Brandon is going to be bringing in a couple of Radiant Flames, perhaps other removal spells like Ether Meltdown, although that's not the best removal spells against zombies.
It doesn't exactly shut down Diregraph Colossus.
And a card we mentioned in Game 1 as being a bit of a liability is Negate. But Negate, I think, gains a bit of value after sideboarding when you have the potential to protect yourself from discard spells with it.
Interesting. So you would be more inclined to leave in Negate to stop cards like Dispossess, potentially Lost Legacy. Because remember, players don't have deck lists. He doesn't know what John Stern's siding in.
Well, I would be really disappointed with the negates that were in my main deck, but the negates that I had access to after sideboarding would be at least, something to give me pause, something to consider.
You wouldn't be mad at the negates. You'd just be disappointed.
Exactly. So far, looking like John Stern's deck choice has been paying off. He's facing a Marvel player that is not as well prepared for the matchup as we might have seen a week or two ago. And his deck just worked perfectly in Game 1.
Yeah, it exactly lined up with what we said beforehand, which I assume makes us very good at our jobs. or lucky that the Marvel deck is just exactly what John was hoping to play against. Note, while John's mulliganing here, Brandon does have a negate in his hand, so he did choose to keep some amount of negates in here.
Makes a lot of sense, especially on the play, because if John doesn't play a 1-drop, then you can feel really comfortable just passing with 2 mana open, protect yourself from Transgress the Mind.
And Brandon even has Ether Meltdown as a potential option too, which does actually shut down something like Dread Wanderer or Miasmic Mummy, even though, again, it's not the most powerful removal spell, but presumably Brandon was looking to take out cards like Dissenter's Deliverance.
Yep, John notably not playing with Metallic Mimic, which is a card that has been, at least in some games, quite impressive in Zombies, but does just serve as a lightning rod for any main deck artifact removal people might be playing to hedge their bets against Aetherworks Marvel.
Feels especially bad, and you just get Manglehorned or something like that.
Right.
So Dread Wanderer here to kick things off for John.
Yeah, John mulligan, but seems to have found a hand he's happy with, starting off with one of his, well, I don't know which is better between Cryptbreaker and Dread Wanderer, but one of 2 very good 1-drops.
Well, the Dread Wanderer does more damage, so I assume that's the tiebreaker. Cryptbreaker did more damage to John that game.
Yeah, I think he was happy about that, though.
Seemed advantageous. So Brandon getting attacked by Dread Wanderer and choosing not to Ether Meltdown here, instead opting to leave Negate and Harness Lightning up.
Yeah, I like that patience. You brought in Negate, and it's not going to be very effective for you if you tap your mana, on your own turn every time. But if you do wait till end of the turn, use your life total as a little bit of a resource here, you can have more options and protect yourself from the discard spells.
And here Brandon taking this opportunity to melt down the Relentless Dead.
Yeah, that's a good answer because with Menace, Relentless Dead is not easy to answer with creatures like Rogue Refiner or whatever it might be.
So Brandon's an interesting spot. He picked up Chandra, but is a few mana away from casting it. He's got an Aetherworks Marvel in hand and a Harness Lightning, but that only gets him to 5 energy, and that's assuming he uses Lightning straight up as an energy source. He is missing a way to generate that 6 energy. Yeah,
so what to do with the Harness Lightning here is an interesting choice. I mean, as you mentioned, the energy is extremely precious here with Aetherworks Marvel being his main action card, but also being able to kill Lord of the Accursed does blunt the damage that John Stern's able to deal.
Yeah,
He decided not to cast it.
Brandon not only didn't cast Harness Lightning on the Lord, didn't actually cast Harness Lightning at all, so he's keeping that option open. What do you think could prompt him to cast it now?
Well, he got to see one more draw step, and as it turns out, he picked up Glimmer of Genius. So now he has something to spend his mana on and might continue to wait on Harness Lightning. But I could see wanting to see know whether you're going to pick up a 5th land to get one step closer to Chandra, because if it does start to feel like Chandra is a realistically castable card, then you're a little bit less reliant on the Marvel and can choose to use your cards in more of a fair one-for-one trade type of way. But the Glimmer certainly makes the decision, or continues to make the decision interesting.
So a Dispossess here. John's actually only copy of that does in fact run into that Negate, so it looks like Negate was a solid choice.
Yeah, that's great there for Brandon, because otherwise he would have lost the Marvel from his hand and been, pretty much at a loss of things to do in this game.
And then that leads Brandon into casting Harness Lightning on the Lord. So ended up being the same as last turn, except he took an additional point, but he preserved his options for an additional turn there.
Now, how much would you value being able to pass the turn with mana open, and how much would you like to just main phase a Marvel or a Glimmer?
Given that Brandon just saw a Dispossess from John's turn, it seems a lot safer from his perspective to play the Marvel, because Mono Black has no way to interact with Marvel once it's in play, but he doesn't know how many Dispossesses or Transgresses John has, and he no longer has Negate to protect him. So this display does not surprise me.
Yeah, that's a good point. The concern I would have is with the cards Brandon has in his hand, he might not be able to affect the board at all next turn. Say for the sake of argument, he draws a tapped land. Then he can't play Chandra, and all he can do is Glimmer, which doesn't give him enough energy. But even glimmering into a tune with Ether would be enough to activate the Marvel. Looks like John's going to have the option to throw a wrench in that plan.
Yeah, so John now casting Transgress here, and he can either take the Chandra that Brandon's a mana off from playing, or the Glimmer that doesn't affect the board. What would you lean towards doing?
Well, this is a unenviable position for John, because both of those cards can either directly or indirectly lead to him losing. So it's tempting to take the Glimmer and just cross your fingers that Brandon doesn't find a 6th land in a relevant time frame. And yeah, I like John's decision there. Not so much that I like it, but I think it's just the one that he had to make. Wow, Yahenni.
Yahenni, Undying Partisan. Resilient against board sweepers. Potentially a reason to leave Brandon with Chandra as well. And actually has additional synergy by sacrificing that Relentless Dead.
Yeah, can you think of a more perfect card when you have a creature with a die ability, enchanted by basically a pacifism? Something that sacrifices it at no cost. Perfect.
So Brandon did not draw the 6th land in order to cast Chandra, but he effectively drew something that very close to that, which is Radiant Flames. It's actually going to work out pretty well. It will get around the Relentless Dead disadvantage here.
Yeah, getting to kill the Relentless Dead when John has no mana untapped gets him out of what otherwise would have been a sticky situation. The Relentless Dead starting to just be a mana sink for John, repeatedly dying and returning other zombies to play.
Brandon even got an energy off that Ether Meltdown hitting the graveyard.
Oh, wow.
Thanks to Aetherworks
That's good looking out.
And Dread Wander returns for John here. Wow, Rogue Refiner for Brandon.
A really nice pickup, because that gets him 2 more energy up to 5, and if John ever attacks into the Rogue Refiner, the Refiner dying will be a 6 energy, and he can go to town with the Marvel.
So Brandon looking like he's in pretty good shape in terms of being able to activate Marvel here. He actually picked up a 6th land and chose not to play it, potentially to conceal Chandra, whether he can play Chandra next turn from John.
I think what we're seeing here is an advantage of playing a strategy like Marvel over an extremely reactive deck like Blue-Red Control, because John has done a great job assembling extremely resilient threats. He has Yeheni, which effectively has Indestructible, and he has Dread Wanderer and Relentless Dead that can keep coming back when you kill them. So with traditional reactive elements like board sweepers and spot removal, Brandon would not be able to contain John. However, all he has to do really is wait till he has enough energy to activate the Marvel, and he can win like that.
So a 5/5 Diregraph Colossus from John's turn, along with the 6th land, which lets him get back his Dread Wanderer. And, well, as we will be many times in this tournament, we're on to a Marvel spin, but I guess that decision wasn't particularly difficult. So Brandon hit Ulamog as the first and last card on the Marvel, so he unsurprisingly is going to summon a gigantic Eldrazi.
So John sacrifices the Colossus to the Yeheni. Important if he draws another Colossus later. But there's not going to be much time for later in this game with Ulamog threatening to close things out quickly.
Especially in conjunction with Chandra being able to remove any potential blockers from John. I highly suspect we're getting a game 3 here.
So in black, the cards that can kill an Ulamog are mostly limited to sacrifice effects, like To the Slaughter, Oath of Liliana, neither of which John Stern has in his deck.
Do you think he's playing any final rewards?
No, but if Ulamog continues to be such a big presence in Standard, it wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility to see a card like that.
The funny thing is, John drew one of the few cards that can't actually let him chump block Ulamog here, Westvale Abbey, because he can make a creature at instant speed and knock it Chandra. But I still don't believe that is a particularly winning strategy. He's not really on the path to victory there. So I think John is mostly deciding whether he wants to show Brandon another 20 cards off Ulamog's exile trigger here. Do you value that sort of knowledge post-sideboard a lot more than pre-sideboard?
I wouldn't say I value it a lot, but in this case, there's just no way John can win, and I don't think there's any reason to really go through the motions. If there was even like a single card or parlay of cards that John could draw to get back in the game, then sure, go ahead and play it out. But if you know the writing's on the wall, then you can concede and save both the time and the information.
So you're a fan of conceding early?
Yep, definitely. As early as possible.
Yeah. Sometimes even when you have a chance to win the game still. Reed, of course, is notorious for not conceding, as it turns out. And you see Brandon shuffle in his whole sideboard and then take out 15 cards. And it looks like John is doing the same.
Now, I think John's sideboarding is probably relatively straightforward. I'm sure he just has a plan and knows what cards are good and what cards are bad in the matchup. Brandon's sideboard can definitely be a bit more flexible. Something like Negate is going to be, as we mentioned, a bit stronger when you're on the play and have more flexibility in terms of keeping mana open. And also, he may have learned a little bit about the way John is sideboarding against him. I mean, for example, he saw Yeheni in that game, which is not a very traditional card for zombies to play. He also saw 20 cards that you and I didn't get a great look at when he attacked with Ulamog, but Brandon's decisions might be a little bit informed, and they might change a little bit from what he did in Game 2.
Yeah, the value of cards like Negate certainly fluctuate based on how many spells, especially like expensive sorcery speed ones, you see out of the zombie deck.
I think John must be pretty happy about where he's gotten the match to at this point. I mean, he's Would have loved to win game 2, of course, but being on the play for game 3 in a post-sideboard game when it seems like his opponent doesn't have a particularly hateful deck, seems like, about where he would want to be.
Yeah, and facing down, a couple copies of Radiant Flames is not the end of the world. The zombie deck is a little more resilient than that.
Boy, I like this technology of Yeheni Undying Partisan. It seemed great against multiple of Brandon's defensive measures, both in being an indestructible threat that's going to live through board sweepers and being able to get creatures into the graveyard if they get stuck under an Ether Meltdown.
It also seems quite effective in matchups that involve a lot of creatures plus sweepers, where maybe Henny just gets to grow a fair amount.
Yep.
No, though, if Brandon is trying to keep John off his back with cards like Whirler Virtuoso, actually, it turns out Brandon doesn't even have any Whirler Virtuosos. So that won't come up. But Yehedi does grow off Whirler, the Thopter tokens, fairly well.
Interesting to see no Whirler Virtuosos, because that's been a almost ubiquitous card in the Temur Marvel decks. But I was talking to Owen Turtenwald this morning, and he has 2 Whirler Virtuosos in his Marvel deck. I said, is this even a good card? He's like, no, not really, but I just played it because everyone's playing it.
Yep, everyone played it, so therefore.
The most interesting dynamic in sideboarding this matchup is if the Temur deck wants to have any creatures post-sideboard. I think Rogue Refiner, is normally a good bet, but more to the point, something like Tireless Tracker or Bristling Hydra, Glorybringer. And on the flip side, should the Mono Black Zombies deck be keeping in any removal spells to hedge their bets against that?
Yeah, it's always a tricky dance of whether you want targets for the removal spells or whether you want removal spells for something like 4 creatures you care about. From watching this kinds of matchup, it seems like it leans towards the zombie decks just not keeping in removal and assuming they can deal with any creatures that Marvel has, like in combat.
Yeah, the zombies deck is in a bit of a unique spot there because it just so grossly outclasses everything else in a fair creature battle. Whereas a more fair deck like Mardu or Black-Green might have to be worried about a Tireless Tracker running away with the game. All right, so both players kept 7. John has the start he wants with a 1-drop. And Brandon seems to have a bit of a reactive hand with Negate and Glimmer of Genius.
He does have that Rogue Refiner there and a Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, so Brandon's going to have a fairly energy-rich draw, even though he doesn't have a Marvel quite yet.
Yeah, so this is the type of game where Dispossessed would be great, would really let John breathe a sigh of relief, but Transgress the Mind is not going to be so good because at any point where Brandon top decks the Marvel, which is, the game could very well go into the middle and late turns, he's immediately going to be able to activate it and threaten hitting Ulamog or a board sweeper.
Though of note, Brandon chose to play a board sweeper that doesn't work with Marvel. So one of the reasons that some players play Sweltering Suns is because it's a Marvel hit, whereas Radiant Flames, because you didn't actually pay the mana for it, ends up not working.
Great point.
And a Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot here for Brandon.
I really like that Brandon is not getting too attached to the negate. I think the way his draw and the way John's draw are shaping up here, it's better to just jam your spells and make sure you're using your mana effectively every turn and setting up to put yourself in the best position if you do draw well, if you do draw your Aetherworks Marvel.
John deciding what he wants to curve out with here, since he's got a couple different options. He's got Crypt Breaker and Relentless Dead, it looks like, as well as a Lord of the Accursed. So the classic decision of, do I want to attack for more? And it looks like the answer is no. He's attacking just with the Scrappy Scrounger, signifying his intent to use Crypt Breaker.
This is the turn where Brandon would love to have a board sweeper, but He doesn't actually have any removal spells, so he's going to have to content himself with getting a little bit more energy and hoping that the top of his library delivers something pretty quickly so he doesn't get overrun by the zombie horde.
Rogue Refiner here for Brandon. Not the Radiant Flames he is looking for. And John, of course, taking the opportunity to draw an extra card off of Crypt Breaker.
Yeah, so he didn't physically tap the creatures there, but he did use the ability of Crypt Breaker at the end of the turn.
Do you think Crypt Breaker would be more powerful if you didn't have to tap the 3 creatures?
Yep. Like a Yawgmoth's bargain, effectively.
I don't know what the problem there would be, but it seems like it could be pretty good. So, John, again, having to decide whether he wants to apply more pressure or draw an additional card here.
Oh, and he does have Dispossess, so this is just exactly the situation John wants to find himself in. He's going to be able to strip away the Aetherworks Marvels from Brandon Ayers. He's up on cards based on having Crypt Breaker in play, and he has 3 threats that can come back from the graveyard if Brandon does sweep his board. So this is a game where I think if John navigates carefully, he's going to have basically all his bases covered.
So John sending in everything but the Crypt Breaker, and Brandon taking this opportunity to trade for a Scrap Heap Scrounger, a temporary trade at best.
I always like to trade with the Scrap Heap Scrounger early in the game when I can because, they can bring it back, like you said, but if they do so, at least that's mana they're spending that's not playing another creature, another threat.
And here comes the Dispossess from John Sturt, almost assuredly naming Aetherworks Marvel.
So the one saving grace from Brandon is that he doesn't have any in his hand. So this is a 1-for-0, card advantage trade. But the problem is he has so few cards that he can draw into now that the Marvels are gone that are going to get him out of this situation.
John also gets to take a look at Brandon's deck and note that there's 2 Radiant Flames and 1 Chandra. So John doesn't have to particularly play around sweepers, or at least not very aggressively do so.
So Brandon's way back into this game is he needs to kill a Crypt Breaker right away. He needs to stop John's flow of card advantage, and then from there he can hope to manage the board little by little. But the problem is, Relentless Dead being on the table makes it so hard to keep Crypt Breaker down forever. Hard casting Ulamog without the Marvels is so far off at this point. He's got the Glimmers to draw him more cards, but he doesn't have a lot of time to spend glimmering and not affecting the board.
Yeah, and now that Marvel isn't an option, Brandon has very few cards that can really reverse this board position. So, like you said, he's really got to draw one of those board sweepers, and even then, the resilient threats on John Stern's side of the board are going to be hard to keep down forever.
You see John just leaving the 1 black mana open. I predict he'll be leaving at least some amount of mana open for as long as he possibly can.
In order to have Relentless Dead not go away forever in the face of a sweeper.
Right. That is one way that John could lose this game, is if he gets a little bit reckless and Brandon draws a timely board sweeper and can actually get rid of the creatures permanently. From my experience, John Stern is an extremely careful player, though. He's going to really try not to leave the door open for something like that.
And John Stern with a number of powerful 3-drops in hand, Lord of the Accursed and a Diregraph Colossus. And he's opting to attack for 5, so he feels like he doesn't need additional cards here.
And this decision might be based on the texture of Brandon Ayers' hand. Seeing that he has 2 glimmers as his main action cards, John might be thinking, I just want to get this game done with. But wow, he actually did tap out.
Yeah,
Brandon needs to find Radiant Flames here.
John added a Diregraph Colossus and a Dreadwander to the board, which of course comes with a zombie. But that does, as you said, put John in a position where if Brandon can find Radiant Flames, then John's whole board just goes away.
Yep. Wisely bottoming both. This is just the key turn here. Radiant Flames or bust.
No Radiant Flames, but Brandon could cycle Censor. He could get 1 card deeper here.
I would do it. I guess even finding a second Harness Lightning would be helpful. That's not the way I would start.
Ed, what makes playing a tune first something that you wouldn't do?
Well, relevantly, he just scryed 2 non-Radiant Flames cards to the bottom, so while sometimes thinning your deck of a land would increase your chances of drawing the card you need, in this case, he's taking 1 bad draw out of his deck, but shuffling 2 back in. We don't even know for sure if he's going to decide to make the Cycle Censor play, but if he does, then I would have done that first.
And here he is, cycling Censor. And drawing Rogue Refiner, which amusingly enough was one of the cards he put on the bottom. We don't know if it's the same Rogue Refiner, of course, but it could be. And that'll do it. Brandon Ayers concedes the game to John Stern. The horde of zombies taking down the Temur Marvel here. And John Stern advancing to 6-0. So we'll be back with more Magic. We've got a few messages for you in the meantime. Grand Prix Omaha. Luis Scott Vargas here with Reed Duke. We just saw John Stern defeat Brandon Ayers with Zombies against Marvel, and got a time walk match for you. So we're going to head down and get to watch a little bit more Magic. Alrighty, welcome to our time walk match here at Grand Prix Omaha. We've got Greg Orange on the left here playing blue-red control against Josh McClain playing black-green Constrictor. Kind of funny because some players have archetypes you really associate with them. I always associate Greg Orange with control. He played Azorius pretty exclusively. He played blue-white and modern, just recently at the Team Grand Prix. And then Josh McClain, known for winning a Grand Prix with Birthing Pod and playing a lot of Birthing Pod. And even though black-green Constrictor is not exactly Birthing Pod, it still feels like it fits within that wheelhouse.
Yeah, definitely. Both these players in their comfort zone. What I find to be the most interesting aspect of this matchup is the original unglued lands versus the unhinged lands on Gregory Orange side of the table.
Which do you think are higher in the official power rankings?
I don't know. Are you responsible for the official power rankings?
I relay them to people, but they are objectively correct. So I'm only a messenger. It's the original lands, of course, are higher in the power rankings. Though both are quite high. And here we've got a decent disruptive start from Greg, who has left it. So he's facing down a Grimflare, but that's it, and his life total's still at a pretty high 18. Kefnet the Mindful from Greg Orange here. Opting for Kefnet as one of his Game 1 threats.
Yeah, I think this game is going the way that Greg Orange wants it to go. Black-green does have a lot of advantages and a lot of ways to win this matchup, but many of them are based on their threats being resilient to removal and sticking one early in the game. But Greg has gotten to the mid-game on relatively safe footing. Josh McClain didn't hit his fourth land on time and then relevantly got censored this turn. So we're getting into the stage of the game where Greg's deck is going to shine relative to Josh's.
Somewhat ambitious play from Greg, right? Playing Kefnet and leaving up Censor instead of Disallow, but he was able to successfully counter a spell. And so that worked out quite nicely for him.
Yeah, and those are the plays that really matter in a matchup like this, is being able to pick your spot where it is safe to invest mana into something like Kefnet, because if you play too reactively, you'll sort of just get outclassed, out-mana'd, out-carded. But that turn went exactly the way he needed it to go, where he gets to spend his mana effectively, get something powerful onto the board, and still not fall behind by use the Censor.
And now that Grimflare does have Delirium thanks to a Walking Ballista heading to the graveyard. So Greg is taking 4 points of damage a turn here, but he still has a decent amount of life to play with. Rishkar Pima Renegade getting hit by Disallow.
Now, I think we might see Greg cycle the Hieroglyphic Illumination. If he didn't have Kefnet, that would be a card that he would value quite highly here and would definitely want to save it to hardcast. But at this point, since he can spend 4 mana for an extra card to be up 1 card anyway, he really just wants to get through his deck as quickly as possible and find an answer to the Grimflayer.
Indeed, Greg did cycle Hieroglyphic Illumination while Josh was busy Grimflaring.
I think he drew into another one, though.
He did, but he notably drew a Torrential Gearhulk on his turn, so that puts him in a position with a lot of options here. Torrential Gearhulk, somewhat reminiscent of Cryptic Command, where regardless of how you play around it, it's going to do something good. How would you approach this turn if you were Josh?
Well, first I would count the number of cards in Greg's hand and see if there's any possible way that Kefnet is going to become active, because that's a very intimidating blocker if so. Next, I would be thinking about Torrential Gearhulk. And that's not to say that I would necessarily not attack into it, but I would want to plan as to minimize its damage if I can. So I want to keep the pressure on while playing around whatever I deem possible to play around. He decided not to play Verdurous Gearhulk pre-combat. That wouldn't be a particularly great way to play around Torrential Gearhulk anyway, since Greg could just Gearhulk a counterspell and then have a blocker that the Grimflayer can't get through. So I like the way that Josh has played this, attacking first, Greg doesn't know whether he has a removal spell or not, but it would be fairly risky to just play the Gearhulk into open mana.
And so Greg opted not to play Gearhulk there, but then when Josh played an Ishkanah post-combat, Gearhulk into Censor actually was managed to counter the
I like
spider.
that he chooses Censor rather than Disallow, just for the little, feel bads.
Plus it keeps Disallowed there for additional Gearhulk action.
Right.
Speaking of which, the Virtuous Gearhulk is trumped by its blue
no.
cousin, as Torrential Gearhulk number 2 disallows the Virtuous Gearhulk. And this leaves Greg with 2 Torrential Gearhulks facing down a 4/4 Grimflayer.
Yeah, when the blue-red control deck begins to have the advantage on the board as well as with cards in hand, that's when it's usually not going to go well for the black-green Constrictor deck. So I predict that Josh is going to lose this game, but, from the point where he was missing his land drops and Greg had a pretty stable board, it seemed that he was going to lose. And I do think the matchup's going to improve for him after sideboarding.
Greg with main phase activating Kefnet, choosing not to return a land, and then contemplating an attack here with potentially both Gearhulks. And both Gearhulks come in, which will take Josh down to 10 life.
So the best Josh can do here is try to defend via Verdurous Gearhulk. Like, for example, if he makes 2 6/6 blockers, but here he's in chump block mode, and a removal spell or a way to activate the Kefnet will be game over.
And Greg didn't actually pay the energy last turn with the Ether, but this is a time walk match, so this happened long enough ago that it is not possible to fix it, nor would it impact the outcome of this game particularly. Two Gearhulks come in. Josh is forced to chump one and go to 5 life, and is now facing down 2 Gearhulks and potentially an active Kefnet next turn as well. And the first game goes to Greg Orange here. And because it's a time walk match, now we're on to game 2. No shuffling time required.
The big relevant change is that Josh is now going to have access to 4 Transgress the Lines here, so he can fight on a new axis that he couldn't in game 1.
And Greg Orange has some options, a number of Essence Scatter against the creature-heavy black-green deck, potentially Thing in the Ice Awoken Horror, Glorybringer. So he's got a lot of different ways, and once again, he's the player that I think has a little more flexibility when sideboarding compared to the black-green deck.
Right. Josh's cards are either good or they're bad. There's a fairly, linear ranking of how good the cards are going to be in the matchup, and he just wants to have his best cards in his deck. Greg is more worried about having a balanced game plan where he has a few answers to everything and, put himself in nice situations where he can keep mana open and use his threats or use his answers against the right threats.
So Harness Lightning takes out the first Grimflayer, but Josh has another one, and Greg has another Harness Lightning. So players trading off cards, which who does this tend to favor?
Well, in game 1, I would certainly say it favors the control player because the black-green Constrictor player is going to have so many ineffectual, cards like Fatal Push that just aren't really good in the matchup. So if Greg can successfully trade with the few cards that are good in the matchup, then he's going to be ahead. After sideboarding, a card like Tireless Tracker completely changes the dynamic of the game. That's a card that makes Josh want to be trading off resources and gives him more staying power and more ability to win the card advantage war.
And Josh cashing in that clue here and setting up potentially Transgress the Mind, though it looks like he's going to cast Traverse the Ulvenwald first. Thanks to Ob Nixilis Reignited, Josh does have an incentive to get up to 5 lands in play. Transgress the Mind, seeing 2 gear hulks and 3 card draw spells that cost 4 mana.
Wow. So it seems like taking the unique card here is the way to go. The one glimmer. You can't cut your opponent on either of the other 2 options, but I guess he's playing for the ultra long game and decides maybe I can fight through 1 gear hulk, but 2 not so much.
And unfortunately for Josh, Greg does hit a 4th untapped land, which goes quite nicely with his 3 different card draw spells that cost 4 mana.
But Josh has access to multiple very powerful planeswalkers that he can just jam here and know they're going to resolve.
And planeswalkers are a weakness for this blue-red deck. It does not
Definitely.
have that many ways to fight them, and Nissa Vital Force here offers Josh a pretty powerful set of abilities. So animating a forest into a 5/5 and clocking Greg for 5 here.
So Greg is probably looking for, well, the best things he could find would be something like his commit to memory, a way to actually directly answer the Planeswalker. But short of that, he probably just wants lands to be able to hit Torrential Gearhulk. Okay, he's going to manage the loyalty a little bit here.
Yeah, Wandering Fumarole sends in and attacks Nissa down to 2, but that did use Greg's entire turn here, leaving him vulnerable to Josh playing potentially another Planeswalker. Ob Nixilis reignited here, providing Josh a steady stream of cards. And Nissa letting Swamp attack Greg down to 10.
Yep, Nissa does untap the land, so free attack there.
Greg does get to kill Nissa now. The second attack from Wandering Fumarole does the trick.
So this is not a complete disaster for Greg, because while Ob Nixilis does provide a nice long-term advantage for Josh McClain, it's at least not killing Greg.
Tireless Tracker here from Josh as he starts to get on the board and even gets to make a clue this turn. And then Josh deciding whether he wants to play his Rishkar Pima Renegade here, whether that would potentially leave him too vulnerable to something like Sweltering Suns.
I think he should play it. I think with Ob Nixilis on 7 loyalty, the worst case scenario is just not that bad for him. You know, losing both creatures, he's still doing pretty well both on the board and with cards in hand.
So Greg just playing a land and passing the turn. He does have Torrential Gearhulk, but Josh also knows Greg has Torrential Gearhulk, so it's not quite as advantageous.
So this is going to be an interesting turn.
Ob Nixilis ticks up, threatening an ultimate.
Yeah, using that pre-combat does limit Josh's options a little bit. It means if he somehow does get ambushed in combat by the Gearhulk, he can't -3 Ob Nixilis after the fact. It might be the case that he doesn't want to do that anyway. I mean, 8 loyalty is a lot better than 4, both because of Ob Nixilis' emblem and because of the Wandering Fumaroles threatening to attack it. So I can't say that I dislike Josh's decision there.
And Winding Constrictor into Rishkar Pima Renegade gives Josh access to a lot of +1 counters if both of these resolve without a hitch.
So could make a case for targeting any of these creatures. Tireless Tracker, likely the most valuable creature. So, you know, he doesn't want to incentivize Greg to use a removal spell on it, but it is also the one that can attack this turn.
And Josh is aware of this Gearhulk out of Greg's hand and actually has used Ob Nixilis, as you mentioned before, so Greg has put an interesting spot. He knows Josh knows about the Gearhulk, but he also knows that unless Josh has a removal spell in hand, the Gearhulk will be an effective blocker. And it looks like Greg is opting to play the Torrential Gearhulk here. And picking up Harness Lightning, which takes out Winding Constrictor and makes the distribution of ++1 counters a lot less effective.
One thing Josh can do is crack his clue before the Constrictor dies and get 2 more counters on the Tireless Tracker anyway. He decides not to.
And the presence of Never to Return in Josh's hand is likely the culprit.
Wow, perfect.
As he then casts it and kills that Torrential Gearhulk. An end of turn Magus Spray does take out Rishkar and leave the way clear for a Wandering Fumarole. But again, if Greg is spending his time and mana in animating Fumaroles, he's not getting ahead on board, and Josh is still drawing extra cards off Tireless Tracker and Ob Nixilis.
Well, one thing I know is that Greg cannot beat the Ob Nixilis emblem. No way, no how. So he's got to either get it right off the board or he's got to knock some loyalty off of it. That's step one. But answering Tireless Tracker while doing that poses a lot of problems.
And with Greg at 5 life, he's kind of looking for a miracle here. And negate off the top, not quite going to do it. Because if he attacks Ob Nixilis, then Tireless Tracker attacks for lethal. If he doesn't attack Ob Nixilis, the emblem with cards like Clues and Greg having card draw spells means that Greg is not long for this world either.
All right, on to game 3.
And that will do it. Josh McClain evens the score up as these players head to game 3. Gregory on the play here, making the 2-mana counters much more effective than they would be. Greg has the option between Essence Scatter and Censor here, and it looks like he's opting to use Censor.
That decision made more interesting by the fact that he did not yet have a 3rd land and might at some point need to cycle Censor to hit his land drops.
The presence of a 2nd Censor in hand, likely the tiebreaker there.
Mm-hmm.
So Greg does have Negate in hand. He could go after this Traverse the Ulvenwald.
Yeah, he actually has 2 negates, so it would be tempting for me there to want to take care of it just because I'd be afraid of playing the whole game without finding a spot to cast my 2 negates. However, if you bite, take the bait, and counter the Traverse the Ulvenwald, Josh could just go land creature, and then you fall behind. So Greg, being the careful control player he is, just decides never to tap his mana until the last possible moment.
Greg opting to use Essence Scatter on Winding Constrictor this time, cycling his 2nd Censor, but he hasn't hit a land drop here. And he did draw another Censor, did not cycle at main phase and just passed the turn.
Where should you go? Die rolling, coin flipping, arm wrestling, rock, paper, lizard, spocking.
Okay, there's 1 negate put to good use.
No revealing cards from the top of your library. If you have any question about whether what you are about to do is legal
Censor
or not,
getting cycled once again.
please call for a judge and ask them away from the table.
So now Greg's starting to feel pretty good about the game. He has a clean board, and he gets to continue passing with Counterspell mana open. Here he's playing Thing in the Ice with Negate. That's very appealing because even if a creature does slip through the cracks, Thing in the Ice can block it and later in the game bounce it back to Josh's hand. Negate, of course, protecting it from removal.
And stopping a lot of Josh's more high impact plays here, like various Planeswalkers.
But Tireless Tracker is just what Josh McClain wants. A card that can't be negated, can't be censored, and is going to provide long-term advantage without having to attack through Thing in the Ice.
And Greg really looking for a red card here in order to kill Tireless Tracker.
He found it.
Removes an ice counter from Thing in the Ice. Ticks up his energy by 1, and somewhat in the same position as last time. He's got Negate up, does not have a Disallow up, even though he does have 1 in hand.
So that was an exchange that netted Josh McClain a clue and netted Greg Orange an energy and an ice counter off of Thing in the Ice.
Nissa answered by Greg's second copy of Negate.
I really like how Josh sniffed out the negate and didn't just go straight for never return. He's going to be disappointed to find that Greg Orange also has Disallow, but maximizing the chance that never return is going to resolve on Thing in the Ice gives Josh the best chance of winning this game.
And here comes Never to Return, which, as you predicted, is met by a Disallow, which ticks down Thing Nest to 1 counter. It's a 1 counter or 1 spell away from Awoken Horror coming down.
That's an attack for 4, Sylvan Advocate.
And kind of neat trick here, Torrential Gearhulk replaying a spell, triggering Awoken Horror, which will then bounce the Torrential Gearhulk back to Greg's hand.
Wow.
Look, he's willing to go out of his way to get an extra card. That is some work. Haven't seen many Sylvan Advocates lately. This was a powerhouse card in the last version of Standard.
Yeah, a bit outclassed by Grim Flayer and by the whole Winding Constrictor, Walking Ballista package. But Sylvan Advocate remains an awesome card. I particularly like it with Rishkar, Pima Renegade, since you can attack and get the mana, and big Vigilance creatures are just great in creature battles.
We've been doing a good job of minimizing no-shows for this event. And that lets people keep
So Greg lets traverse the Ovenwald Resolve, but likely this Tireless Tracker will prompt a response.
feature match for round 7 from table 3.
And there's the trick that you mentioned a moment ago, using Torrential Gearhulk for free, and turning it right back to its hand.
From table 33, Michael Cochran.
And this puts Awoken Horror into play, a 7/8, and then lets Greg keep Torrential Gearhulk with Disallow or Harness Lightning in graveyard.
Table 3, Dickman versus
So
Nass. Table 10, Hunt versus Orange. Table 33, Cochran versus
Greg deciding how aggressive he wants to be, and ultimately he settles on the Awoken Horror coming in for 7.
Now, the race math doesn't look as good for Greg as it might initially seem, because Josh McClain has 3 Hissing Quagmires that are all going to be 4/4s. So he's not too far from being able to just attack for 12.
So Greg lets Rishkar resolve, lets Hissing Quagmire resolve, or activation resolve, and attacks with both. And
I love the attack with both, because normally the Sylvan Advocate would just bounce off of Torrential Gearhulk, but now you at least put Greg to the test of if you wanted to block the Hissing Quagmire, now you're taking 5. But it works out perhaps not so great for Josh there, as Greg's able to block and then just Harness Lightning for 1 damage to finish off Sylvan Advocate.
And the player's going at breakneck speed as we've sped it through reporting, just a little bit. But that attack for 12 takes Josh down to 1, now facing down a 5/6 and a 7/8. He's got some Hissing Quagmires, but having to leave up mana every turn for Quagmire is not a particularly winning strategy.
This was a great game. I was really impressed by Greg's ability to fight through the initial card advantage of Josh McClain, getting that Tireless Tracker into play, a free clue, the Hissing Quagmires. Wow, big draw from Greg.
That is the Planeswalker package in the early bird special. Can now be collected at the information desk by
Yep, that'll do it. The second gear Hulk.
And the second gear Hulk does the trick. Greg Orge advances to 6-0 over Josh McClain here at Grand Prix Omaha. And we've got some messages for you, but we'll be back with round 7 after these messages.